of the Book of Ecclesiastes reveals that there is more than one voice in the book. The primary voice is referred to as Kohelet. This is Hebrew, which roughly translates as the assembler, the one who assembles, the convener maybe. Most modern Bible translations will write this as the teacher or the preacher, but I will refer to him as Kohelet. Now, Kohelet is responsible for most of the book. He speaks in the first person, and his address is quite long. He says, "And I applied my heart to seek and to search out. I have seen everything that is done under the sun. So I became great. I hated all my toil. Again I saw. My vain life I have seen. Then I saw. But all this I laid to heart," and so on as he continues. Kohelet's address is markedly autobiographical in nature. Now, however, there is a second voice in the book that speaks about Kohelet in the third person. And this voice is most discernible in two places. In the introduction to the book, where he introduces Kohelet and his topic, and then at the close of the book, where he provides an assessment of Kohelet and his speech, and then provides his own conclusion. This opening and closing of the narrator constitutes a frame around Kohelet's address. And this has a couple effects. The narrator is the implied author of the whole book. He is the one who gives Kohelet room to speak, allows him to convey his thoughts, and does so for his own reasons. But also, this narrator is the authoritative voice. He is the one who has the final word, both sequentially and authoritatively. So the opening and the closing constitute this frame. And the narrator closes off the book with his final conclusion at the end. And this is what the book is, one of the things it's most known for. The narrator's conclusion comes in the final two verses, chapter 12, verse 13 and 14. "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." And everyone agrees this is the narrator's conclusion. And basically everybody agrees this represents a standard Orthodox, faithful view reflecting Israel's covenantal relationship with God. However, there is no such agreement when it comes to Kohelet or anything about Kohelet. This man who speaks for the majority of the whole book of Ecclesiastes, who talks about this, talks about that, has many pointed things to say, raises many interesting questions. What is his message? What is his central point? Even at the basic level, what is he getting at in the end? And this is where scholarship is all over the map. This is where you can pick up two commentaries and they will probably say two completely different things. When I first started studying Ecclesiastes, I was blown away by how contradictory all the scholarship was on this. One scholar in commentary might say this, another would say something else, and then another one would say something completely different. And it's like, I was thinking, we have like 12 chapters of the Bible here, and how is it that we don't even know what it's about? Like, on the basic level, what is this? What is the message? We'd expect some disagreement on, some finer details, on some, little points like that, but we're not talking about those. The basic level, the central message, what it all boils down to, could you summarize it? What is it about? And that's where there is no agreement. So how do we navigate this mess? Most of all scholarship can be put into a couple basic categories. Kohelet's address has a few key motifs. We will speak of hevel. This is a Hebrew word, which you might translate as meaningless, or a few other options. We also have joy and the fear of God. These three, hevel, joy, and the fear of God. And the vast majority of scholarship elevates one of these three motifs as the central message of Kohelet. One of these three motifs. So identifying which motif a scholar elevates, as well as seeing its interrelation to the other key motifs will give you a pretty good understanding of what a scholar's reading of the book is. Now, as a disclaimer, these are not simple, rigid categories. There is a bit of a spectrum involved here, as they will have different interpretations of what some of these motifs mean, and there'll be differences in the degree to which one motif is elevated above the others, and in the nature of its relation to the other motifs. That being said, the framework is still pretty simple and surprisingly effective. So the most characteristic motif in the book is Hevel. And it should come as no surprise that many scholars identify Hevel as Kohelet's core message. As soon as we get to the second verse of the book, we read, Hevel of Hevels, says Kohelet. Hevel of Hevels, all is Hevel. So this is clearly a prominent theme that's starting to come out. So what is Hevel? This word literally means breath or vapor, but to state the obvious, it is being used in a metaphorical or figural sense here. But the difficulty is pinning down exactly what that sense is. What is it about this image of Hevel that is capturing the message that Kohelet is trying to convey? Many scholars interpret decidedly negative connotations, and they'll translate Hevel as meaningless, or vanity, or futile, worthless, senseless, pointless, useless, absurd, and so on and so on. So accordingly, as a vapor or a wisp of smoke is insubstantial, so is your life and anything you do in life. It's all meaningless. Others prefer to go for a slightly more neutral translation of Hevel, and they might say something like fleeting or enigmatic. You see, translation is interpretation. And while the difference of choices might seem inconsequential or marginal, the choices here that you make can have a huge effect on one's reading of the book. So to say, for example, that everything is meaningless is a wholly different claim than to say that everything is mysterious or enigmatic. It's a very different claim. The former is decisively negative and decisively decisive claim on a subject's character. This is what it is. But the latter simply states that something is unknowable. But it does not claim if this is good or bad. It just leaves these doors open. So that former claims knowledge, but then the other one just acknowledges ignorance. Still different from these is the assertion that everything is fleeting. This, again, is neutral. Doesn't say if it's necessarily good or bad. It just speaks to a reference temporality. So Hevel is used many times in the book. And the difficulty is that what might work in some cases doesn't necessarily work well in all of them or the other ones. So some argue for multivalency, that this image is meant to carry different nuances, that when you apply it to different situations, it can have different applications. It might mean more transience here, or more emptiness or here, or so on, so on. The idea is that the image would invite the reader in to consider this image and ponder the way that it might reflect one's experience of reality in this situation. And now this situation, inviting the reader in to consider. Now, as we were saying, a large number of scholars elevate Hevel to this first position as representing Kohelet's central message. And most of those who do tend to lean to a quite negative view of Hevel. Longman and Crenshaw are good examples here, but be assured they have no shortage of company. With their elevation of Hevel, they tend to have a lower view of the other motifs. So joy, for example, is completely meaningless, just like your life. It's merely an empty resignation. Longman describes enjoyment as nothing more than a narcotic that numb one to the true nature of reality. This also brings a negative view of God. For Crenshaw, The deity stands distant, abandoning humanity to chance and death. God is to blame. He is guilty of this evil. So in some, those who elevate Hevel, there's a central message, usually see it quite negatively, minimize all allusions or imperatives to rejoice or enjoy, and have a view of God that is distant, indifferent, or cruel. But not everyone elevates Hevel. As a maybe second most common option, many elevate joy. And they would see Hevel as maybe the world that he encounters, but joy is Kohelet's response to it. Many who elevate joy would turn first to Wybray and his work, who labels Kohelet as a preacher of joy. There are many joy passages throughout Kohelet's address, interspersed here, there, and there throughout, and they seem to steadily build in emphasis, grow as a crescendo as they become longer, larger, more direct, more emphatic as the address moves on. Those who elevate Hevel see joy quite negatively, typically, but those who elevate joy's essential message see it not as a meaningless resignation, but as a positive commendation. There is some good to this. There are good things in this world, good things from God that should be enjoyed. And in fact, some take that even further and say this commendation of enjoyment is actually a divine command that you are called to enjoy. And if you don't, God will judge you, and etc. But that's a little less common as it goes maybe a little too far. So in general, Hevel is the problem. Joy is the advice or solution to it. This is how one can live and navigate life, seize the day, live life to the full, embrace every opportunity for enjoyment that comes your way. So most give weight to Hevel or joy and elevate that to first position as Kohelet's essential message. And most downplay the fear of God motif. Why? Popularized in the early 20th century was a developmental view of wisdom, where it was seen to have grown from an early secular, maybe more universalistic idea to later becoming more religious and closer to Israel's faith that way. Accordingly, the verses about the fear of God and some of the other religious material were often dispelled as seen as the hands of later glossateurs who added these to the book to maybe tame Kohelet's wild advice. But all we need to do is remove them, then we can get back to the more original Kohelet. That approach is less common now, thankfully so, because there is really no textual evidence to support that these were just later additions. But those who don't just ignore it or delete it tend to interpret the fear of God through the lens of Kohelet's apparent cynicism. You see, Kohelet was thought to represent what had come known to be a wisdom crisis. They thought, well, Proverbs was simplistic. It conveyed a mechanical act-consequence nexus, such that actions had built-in results. These actions led to this result, these ones to this. Do these and you'll lead to flourishing and blessing. Do these, it'll lead to suffering and consequences. So it was this mechanical actions almost secured or guaranteed a certain outcome. But then Kohelet comes along, and Job to some extent as well, and says, yeah, no, that's not how the world works. Those promises are naive. This is misleading, false. He's blowing the whistle on the whole spiritual abuse, tearing the whole thing down, representing this type of wisdom crisis. And so when Kohelet then talks about God, it is viewed from this deconstructionist lens, and the result is a God who is distant, oppressive, cruel, and guilty. The problem is that's just not how the book of Proverbs works. Proverbs are not mechanical promises. They have to be applied to the right situation. And that takes wisdom. You can look at examples of the early bird gets the worm, or the second mouse gets the cheese. Many hands make light work, or too many chefs spoil the broth. Squeaky wheel gets the grease, or the hammer that sticks out gets nailed. These are all true proverbs, but they're contextualized. They apply to certain situations, and they need to be applied to the right situations. Or as Proverbs 26:9 says, like a thorn that goes into the hand of a drunkard is a proverb in the mouth of fools. Dangerous, hurtful. So Proverbs is aware of the same exceptions or difficulties that Kohelet sees. It's aware of them. It references them. It mentions them. Proverb knows that sometimes the wicked are prosperous and the righteous are poor. Sometimes we do not see justice, but it's focused on teaching the basics, the general. So notions of a wisdom crisis or a Kohelet in revolt of his inherited tradition, deconstructing this mess, are just built on a shallow reading of Proverbs. So if Kohelet is not to be simply dismissed as the aimless ramblings of an embittered old man, how then should he be read? And I would like to propose that chapter 11, verse 7 to 12:7 represents Kohelet's final conclusion. But even if we are to speak of such thing as a final conclusion, this presupposes a level of structure and movement to his address. And as anybody who has studied the book a little bit knows, past inquiries into structure have been largely unfruitful. The nature of Kohelet's meandering musings wreaks havoc on our modern linear sensibilities because Kohelet does not progress A to B to C to D. Kohelet takes a more circular approach as he visits a theme here and then comes over here, often circling back and revisiting earlier themes as he moves around and moves around. Which, by the way, is often how we sometimes think when we're faced with difficult decisions and we flip-flop between one side and the next. Oh, there's this, but this, but this, but this. More recent efforts have recognized Kohelet's address as a narrative. And I would like to argue that this narrative has a trajectory that progresses to and culminates in Kohelet's final section, such that it can be read as the conclusion. Kohelet's circuitous ruminations are not trapped. They break free and purposefully progress forward to an end with a clear vision for life. But before we get to the end of Kohelet's account, we need to start at the beginning. Kohelet's address begins in chapter 1, verse 12, with his self-introduction. I, Kohelet, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. In the next verse, Kohelet introduces his quest, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out his methodology by wisdom, and the object and scope of his search, all that is done under heaven. Immediately, Kohelet reveals the conclusion of his search. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is hevel and the striving after the wind. This conclusion comprises what will become a recurring refrain throughout his quest. Now, at first glance, this quest might seem positive. The book of Proverbs, after all, does encourage one to seek wisdom. Seek it like silver, search for it as hidden treasure. The father exhorts his son, get wisdom, get insight. And wisdom says, for whoever finds me finds life. Given the connection between these books, one might be excused for thinking that Kohelet is in conducting such a search. But his initial introduction and conclusion clearly say that something is awry. Kohelet declared that he had great wisdom, conducted his search by wisdom in order to know wisdom, yet concludes that everything is hevel. So the reader is drawn in and led to wonder how this came to be, to raise objections, to expect an explanation, and ultimately to look toward resolution. In the ensuing chapters, Kohelet proceeds and recounts his efforts and his experiences. Houses and vineyards, parks and gardens, silver and gold, servants and concubines, toil and pleasure, wisdom and folly, life and death, and on and on. He says, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil that I expended in doing it. And behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Everything is hevel, everything is hevel, everything is hevel. Now, some scholars probably stop there because they conclude that that is the sum of Kohelet's wisdom. But Kohelet does not stop. He continues. When we come to the end of chapter 7, kind of a midpoint through his address, we encounter a significant point, a moment of confession and reflection. This section, Kohelet reflects honestly on his quest up to this point and its results. He begins, all this I have tested by wisdom, looking back over all his quest, all that he has done. And there's many signs here of the narrator or the writer intentionally connecting it with his opening introduction. So the reader who has followed the quest knows the results have been less than satisfactory. Now, in a language reminiscent of Job 28, Kohelet confesses his failure. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is off and deep, very deep. Who can find it out? The understanding that Kohelet sought was beyond his grasp. He was not able to make sense of life's mysteries nor control its irregularities. His quest had failed. Noting the irony, some commentaries will write that this wise man who journeyed with wisdom in the search for wisdom cannot grasp wisdom. So in this assessment of his quest, Kohelet does not merely reflect on what he did not find, the answers that eluded him. He also comments on what he did find. In fact, this section has a pronounced interplay between finding and not finding, as this verb to find is used several times in this short section. After initially confessing his failure and asking who can find it out, his next use of this verb comes in verse 26, where he presents what he did find. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Without going into too much detail, this should be understood as an allusion to Lady Folly in the book of Proverbs, not a specific woman, but more representative of folly itself. So in short, Kohelet sought wisdom, but instead of finding wisdom, he found himself entrapped by folly. The last few verses then of chapter 7 build to Kohelet's final statement here. This thought of his last few verses begins in verse 27 with, behold, this is what I found. But Kohelet then pauses to reiterate that he sought an account of things, which his soul sought repeatedly, but he was not able to find. Indeed, he was able to find a man among 1,000, but not a woman. This delay, building anticipation of his final statement, which then comes in verse 29. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. There's an interesting play on words here in the Hebrew, where the word for account and scheme sound similar. They share a root, and they are used in connection to this verb to seek. So Kohelet sought wisdom and an account of things. He added things together to find an account, which he sought, but he could not find. But what he did find is that God made humanity upright, but they have sought out schemes. Kohelet is the one who sought an account of things, but ended up chasing schemes. While he sought wisdom, he is the sinner ensnared by Lady Folly. Though Kohelet's confession brings a measure of clarity, resolution still evades. Where does he go from here? What advice does he have to offer in light of this unsettling discovery? Now, the second half of his address reveals a shift from experience to expression. His quest is now largely behind, and it was a failure. But his focus increasingly turns to the imparting of advice. The first person narration, which was so prominent early on, as Kohelet recounted his adventures, really subdues, and the second person exhortations and imperatives pick up momentum. And in addition, there is a larger inclusion of proverbial sayings. Now, as noted earlier, there's not a clear, definitive boundary between them, but there is a clear progression as Kohelet keeps moving forward. So in the second half, rather than the pursuit of knowledge that drove Kohelet's quest, this latter half betrays a greater acceptance of one's limitations. A theme that was actually revealed in Kohelet's initial introduction. Kohelet highlights what one cannot know. He highlights what one cannot change what God has done. One cannot know what will be after him. Some have described the second half as tempered with an epistemological humility, and others speak of a hard-won ignorance. Kohelet's failed quest becomes the context for which he can instruct. He has accepted the limitations of humanity, recognizing what is unknowable and uncontrollable, and counseling how one should live. And now this progression leads to Kohelet's final conclusion. Before we look at Kohelet's final conclusion, it is worth briefly asking if we can rightly speak of this final section as his conclusion. And in short, I would say yes, we can. We can note a few reasons in passing. We see the first mention of the implied reader of Kohelet's address. So this adds to the sense that the book is drawing to a close and he is imparting that which is most important. We see the clear drop of the first person. The last couple chapters of the book have no first person anymore. We see the increase of the second person, this imperative and these commands becoming more and more frequent and emphatic. And this final section has a whole string of these imperatives, one after another, after another, after another. Kohelet is done recounting his past. He has learned from mistakes and his experiences, and he is focused on teaching and imparting his closing advice. We also can note that the three themes of Hevel, joy, and the fear of God come together. Hevel dominated early on in the address, but then it faded out quite a bit as Kohelet left the quest behind and moved to instruction. The theme of joy has been steadily building through the address to this final moment. The fear of God has been kind of steadily punctuated throughout, but they come together here at the end. And of course, to state the obvious, it comes at the end. All signs point to a purposeful conclusion. So it would be worth beginning this by briefly reading Kohelet's conclusion, found in 11, verse 7 to 12, verse 7. He says, "Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many days, let him rejoice in them all, but let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is Hevel. Rejoice, O young men, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are Hevel. Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, And then for the sake of time, I won't read the rest of the closing poem. This final section of Kohelet is centered around and dominated by a string of imperatives. Rejoice, walk, know, remove, put away, and remember. Now, one might ask, wait, but what about that closing poem? There's a fair bit going on there. Kohelet's final command comes in chapter 12, verse 1. Remember also your creator. And that launches into this elaborate poem with many memorable images and figures. But this whole poem is centered around this beginning and consists of a series of temporal clauses that I'll begin with before. So it's remember your creator before. So the effect is that this whole closing poem is one single sentence with its main clause at the beginning in 12 verse 1. Remember also your creator. That is the foundation for this whole poem. So yeah, we can speak of how this whole closing section is centered around this succession of imperatives as his central idea. So let's walk through these verses. In 11:7-8, this forms a bit of an introduction or transition, if you will, into this final section. Kohelet begins with an affirmation of joy, conveyed through imagery of light and note of enjoyment, but he also recognizes the darker side of life when he says that all that comes is hevel. While his earlier pronouncements have typically carried more specificity when he would say, this is hevel, or I experienced this and this is hevel, here his words are more general. All that comes is hevel. It has a more summative character as he references all that he has explored, all of his address, all of life. And while hevel is greatly diminished in the second half of the book, it does resurface here. In this final section, Kohelet acknowledges this context of hevel, this world of hevel that we live in, before continuing to impart his final instruction. So after reiterating this context of hevel, Kohelet proceeds with his first imperative. Rejoice. He says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. The two halves are clearly parallel. This familiar note of rejoicing has sounded throughout his address, so its appearance here should come as no surprise. And increasingly throughout his address, Kohelet has put forward this joy as something to be commended. Immediately, the reader encounters the next imperative. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. This second exhortation is generally understood as an elaboration on the first. Speaking of one's conduct as it concerns the pursuit of enjoyment. Have a go at life. Try something. Follow your heart. This idea of pursuing something desirable leads well from what was earlier in chapter 11, where it talked about the unknowability of the future. You don't know what will succeed, whether this or that, but does not want one to be crippled by inaction and encourages one to still have a go, try something, pursue something. But still, is this walking in the ways of one's eyes and heart, is this path good or bad? Does this promote hedonism, licentiousness, or is this enjoyment more restrained? Many have taken this verse as an example of Kohelet's waywardness, of this wisdom crisis and his departure from the faith, thinking that the verse not only condones, but encourages the pursuit of selfish desires, as Kohelet's given up on life, so why not? Some point to a command in the Torah, in Numbers, where one is commanded to not follow after one's heart and one's eyes, and concludes that Kohelet is twisting the law here and has clearly departed from the faith. But such paths result simply from misunderstanding Kohelet. The previous joy passage in chapter 9 has some similarities. It speaks of divine approval. God has already approved what you do. And its encouragement that whatever your hand finds to do it with your might, is similar to his idea of pursuing here. Excuse me. Is the season, hey?
Yeah.
More broadly, we can also note that Kohelet has presented joy as a gift from God, as something good that God allots. He has already shared his disapproval of all indulgence that is excessive, inappropriate, untimely, and he has regularly criticized folly. In chapter 6, verse 9, he said, "Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite." Here, the sight of the eyes is positive, and it is against giving into wandering desires. So the interpretation that the enjoyment that Kohelet is endorsing here is inappropriate or immoral in any way runs counter to the rest of his address. And Kohelet's next imperative makes this even clearer. At the end of verse 9, we read, "But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment." So for many, this mention of divine judgment seems out of place. A previous generation of scholars concluded that the recognition of divine judgment does not fit with Kohelet's address, with his departure from the faith. So it is obviously a later addition from some more conservative hands that sought to temper Kohelet's claims. But again, with no textual evidence to support these ideas, best not to delete the verse. So many modern commentators instead opt for more creative ways to circumvent Kohelet's wisdom. Some see a cruel trap here by God. God has given you these things to enjoy, tempts you to enjoy, wants you to enjoy, but then will judge you for that very enjoyment. Thus, God is cruel. Others see this in the other direction as a divine command, or even a threat. Enjoy, or else. But that does not seem to be Kohelet's message. Kohelet has already warned of excessive judgment, and he has upheld the value of mourning. So clearly, enjoyment does not seem to be the highest goal in life. There is a better and more obvious option. The call to recognize divine judgment is meant to ground and guide all of one's enjoyment, pursuits, and indeed all of one's life. The theme of judgment has occurred a number of times throughout the book, and in each case where it has occurred, it has been in a discussion of the righteous and the wicked, that is, one's moral conduct before God. The result here is that while enjoyment is good and a gift from God and can and even should be pursued, it is not an end in itself. Instead, joy is qualified. Yes, it is a central part of Kohelet's advice, to his advice about living in a world of Hevel, but it is grounded by the understanding of divine judgments on one's actions, implying, therefore, that one is to fear God. So while these two motifs of joy and fear God are prominent parts of his advice, the one is clearly foundational. Verse 10 brings two more imperatives, number 4 and 5. It says, "Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body. For youth and the dawn of life are Hevel." Remove and put away. The important question here concerns the objects of removal. The first object is vexation, or grief, or anger. And the word has occurred a handful of times already in Kohelet's address. In 7:9, he says, "Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools." So there is something about this anger that marks the way of a fool and the removal of it should be associated with the wise and their actions. And coming on the heels of judgment, it would make sense that the reader is encouraged to remove or avoid those things for which one could be judged. The second undesirable object in this verse is the word ra'ah. This noun possesses a quite large semantic range, carrying nuances of evil, wickedness, misfortune, or disaster. It's a very common word in the Old Testament and in Kohelet's address. So the real question is, how is it being used here? Is he using it in a moral sense or not? Most scholars, by far, try hard to avoid any religious or moral interpretation of Kohelet's address, especially here. Accordingly, they might read a command to remove pain or suffering and connect this verse to the previous verse's calls to enjoyment. That is, remove those things that hinder you from enjoyment. However, a closer look revealed that moral reading of evil is not only possible, but preferable in this situation. So first, the readings of the verse of the command to remove pain or remove sickness is just simply illogical. For one, even a fool does not want sickness or pain or suffering. You don't really need to command even a fool that, hey, you don't want those things. Why would Kohelet feel the need to instruct to remove them? And for the most part, those things are largely not under your control anyways. Are we to believe Kohelet's grand conclusion is to tell the sick and the suffering to remove their sickness and their pain? Is that Kohelet's grand conclusion here? Second, moral readings of the word evil are common throughout Kohelet's address. And there is also a lot of other religious and moral language in the book, so the occurrence here would not be out of place. We can also note that the use of the verbs to remove or put away in connection with moral evil is incredibly common in the Old Testament. Job was repeatedly announced as one who feared God and turned away from evil. And the climax of Job's great wisdom poem in chapter 28 declares, "Behold, fear the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding." Likewise, Proverbs says, "Be not wise in your own eyes, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil." Turning from evil, as part of what it means to fear God, is at the very heart of wisdom's message, not only in Job and Proverbs, but also in Ecclesiastes. Lastly, we should remember that this comes in the context of divine judgment. Many interpreters connect these verbs of removal to the joy that was in the prior verse, the commandments or the imperatives to rejoice. But those only begin in that prior verse. The prior verse ends on a note of judgment. In fact, the last word in verse 9 is judgment, and then the first word in verse 10 is remove. So how could one familiar with the tradition read judgment, immediately followed by remove and put away, then read evil, and not immediately connect the dots? It would seem that non-moral readings here are working too hard to unnecessarily sidestep the obvious. Yes, enjoy God's good gifts, but in light of the coming judgment on all things, remove and put away all that would bring you under that judgment. Kohelet's sixth and final imperative comes in chapter 12, verse 1. Remember also your Creator. In keeping with the healthy tradition of those who worked very hard to remove God from the book, some sought to amend this text and to read, remember your pit, or your well, or your strength. Again, however, with no textual support, this movement has largely flamed out. But still, many try to interpret it, remember your Creator, as an empty reference to God and a further call to enjoyment. But there is so much more going on here. Remember your Creator. The verb remember is not merely an intellectual recollection. It is a dynamic concept that carries itself out in one's actions. Some argue that a better understanding of this idea to remember would be to consider or would be to obey. The verb to remember has wide theological usage in the Old Testament, commonly pertaining to aspects of the covenantal relationship between Israel and God, where remembering or forgetting is particularly connected with keeping or rejecting God's commandments. While this is a common concept, Israel's wisdom tradition more typically writes this as the fear of the Lord. And the two can mean essentially the same thing here. Kohelet's call to remember God should bring to the reader's mind also all the rest of his teachings about God throughout his address. Kohelet spoke of God's sovereignty, divine judgment, that one should fear God. There is a consistent notion in his address that one must recognize God's position, sovereign over everything, and humanity's position before him. There is also correspondence between the imperatives of removal in the prior verse as a turning away from, and this remembering as a form of turning to. Youth is fleeting, death is approaching, therefore remove and turn from evil and turn to God. As we noted earlier, the immediate context here is divine judgment, a call to turn from evil, thus an understanding of remember your Creator as a functional equivalent to fear God is most natural. Kohelet, in his initial quest, sought wisdom and understanding, but right from the initial summary of Hevel, it was clear that something was wrong. In his midpoint reflection, he confessed his failure. The wisdom he sought was beyond his grasp. He found himself entrapped by folly. He was the sinner ensnared. The one who departed from created uprightness, the one who sought out many schemes. As Kohelet increasingly moved from his failed quest to his present and primary goal of instruction, he regularly advocated for a proper understanding of humanity before God, recognizing one's limitations of what one can know, of what one can control, and accepting God's sovereignty. And now, at the end of his address, conveying his final message, he calls his addressee to know that God will judge everything, to remove evil, and to remember the Creator/fear God. While the misguided quest of Kohelet's younger self resulted in Hevel, the message of the aged sage declares the proper foundation, the fear of the Lord. As a passing note on Kohelet's poem in chapter 12, while there is lots of disagreement about some of the individual images and what they may refer to, there is clear agreement that the poem is about death. This is meant to bring a sense of urgency to Kohelet's final message. His goal is not to merely inform the reader that death is coming, but rather to instruct one how to live in the present before that end is reached. Life is short, your time is near. Heed his advice today. Live your life while you can, pursue your desires, but remember your Creator. Fear God and keep his commandments, turning away from evil, for there will be a judgment. Before I close, I should also make a quick passing remark on the epilogue, as it is hermeneutically significant for the interpretation of the book as a whole. Remember, Kohelet's address is the majority of the book, but it does come in the context of a narrative frame. A narrator introduces Kohelet, allows him to speak, but then the narrator closes the book with his assessment of Kohelet and his own final conclusion. He gets the final word. In this epilogue, the narrator offers a brief assessment of Kohelet and his own conclusion. The narrator first describes Kohelet as wise, one who taught the people knowledge. He weighed and studied and arranged proverbs with great care. He sought words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The narrator's assessment here is clearly positive. All of those interpretations that read Kohelet in a negative light, they, as a wisdom crisis, as rejecting the faith, they have to work pretty hard here and get creative in their exegesis to kind of get around the narrative's clearly obvious affirmation of Kohelet in order to fabricate antithesis. Next, when the narrator says, the words of the wise are like goads, and the making of many books there is no end, he's acknowledging the difficult aspects of Kohelet. Kohelet does ask some difficult questions. They can sting, but his aim is to guide the reader. His wisdom will prove beneficial for those who will heed its prick. He's also acknowledging the limitations of human wisdom. There are many things in life that we do not have answers for, and Kohelet faces this squarely. Lastly, the narrator closes with his famous words, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." This is not a rejection of Kohelet's message. It's not a correction of his message, nor is it a subtle redirection of emphasis. The narrator is not trying to temper Kohelet's radical claims to ease acceptance, as many different scholars have suggested. Some even think the narrator just completely misunderstands Kohelet altogether and just gets the whole thing wrong. Rather, what we see here is the narrator affirming and echoing Kohelet's central and final message. The 3 points of the narrator's conclusion here are the same final few points that we saw in Kohelet. Fear God, this idea of remember your creator. Keep his commandments, that is, turn from evil. And 3, that there will be a judgment. Kohelet, just before was mentioned, the judgment that covers all things, which includes one's enjoyment and the pursuits of one's desires. Kohelet's opening to imperatives. The narrator upholds and echoes Kohelet's message. So tonight, I have argued that the narrative of Kohelet's address progresses to a conclusion in 11:7 to 12:7, in which Kohelet brings together the primary motifs of Hevel, joy, and the fear of God, makes clear their interrelation, and conveys his central message. While Hevel describes the findings of his failed quest and becomes the context from which he instructs and commends joy, Kohelet ultimately upholds an orthodox position as he presents wisdom, as he presents the fear of God as the foundation for wisdom. Accordingly, Kohelet is no skeptic, pessimist, or hedonist, nor does he represent a crisis of wisdom or faith. Rather, Kohelet stands in the canon as a faithful witness, offering wise counsel for life, with all its difficulties and mysteries. And like those who came before him, he proclaims, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. Thank you.
Amen.
Amen.
Believe it or not, I had to ask Ryan this morning what he was going to wear. I didn't want to feel underdressed, so stretching my legs a little. I'm trying to keep up with the dressing game here. Like Drs. Morelli and Spencer mentioned, we share this academic history, right? We graduated from the same program, graduated in the same year. Our dissertation defense was actually a day apart. And Ryan finished his a day before I did, so you have that over me. Our
Senior.
yeah, exactly. Our supervisor, he lived in the States, so he would come, I think, a couple of times a year to meet with the doctoral students, teach a couple of courses here and there. And so he had a very limited time of when he could meet the doctoral students. So all of our meetings, our supervisions were kind of back to back. So all of his students, after the supervision, we would kind of, get together impromptu. There would be encouragement, there would be venting, there would be hevels thrown around here and there. I believe there were a lot of tears involved as well. And so, we had that, we shared that. And because we were both interested in Ecclesiastes, we probably had a lot more discussions than we did with others. And to continue with the Hunger Games metaphor, I think we survived. I think we both came out as victors as kind of a team. So I don't know who Katniss is in this analogy, but yeah, I'm really happy that we both got through the program, and to see your work in the public setting is really exciting. With the time that I have, I'd like to note a couple of significant contributions of Dr. Ball's paper, and then I'll follow up with some questions that relate to some of the comments that I have. One of the significant contributions of this paper relates to the integrity of the text, the book itself. And as he alluded, the Book of Ecclesiastes over the years has been scrutinized due to its seemingly haphazard nature in dealing with different topics or motifs. What Dr. Ball saw, and rightly so, as circular, many scholars in the past saw as fragmented, either being from multiple sources. I believe one scholar argued that there are 27 hands or sources in this book. And in other cases, some view the book as just fully put together. I think in one instance, I found it amusing that someone thought that there was a book of Ecclesiastes. Somebody was carrying it around, dropped it, papers flew around, and kind of put them together. And I don't know what comes first. There was no page number, so this is Ecclesiastes, right? So coming out of that kind of discussion. Now I think there is a more move to saying the final form that we have actually has some logic to it. Of course, there were others that dealt with this issue in their own ways. Some argue for a very detailed and a very strict structure based on numerical values of certain words, while others have argued there is no structure, and that's the intention of the book. Right, so someone that Dr. Ball mentions in his paper is Tremper Longman, and he writes that Kohelet's thought, quote, rambles, repeats, and occasionally contradicts itself. And so for Longman, this is actually the intention of the book. And what the paper argues in a very convincing way is that there is a specific logic to this book, and movement, I think, is the right word. What's particularly helpful is how the paper argues that there are movements with the main motifs, touching on these motifs like hevel, joy, and fear of God. And without elevating one over the others, I think he successfully argues that these motifs intensify or diminish and ultimately culminates and reaches a pinnacle in the final two chapters of the book. And by doing so, it makes sense of this somewhat difficult poem you see in chapter 12. It's dark, it looks like the world is ending, but I think the way that he presented it actually makes sense. Another significant contribution of this paper is that it deals with the epilogue issue in a very positive way. Historically, typically or predominantly, the epilogue is read over against the words of Kohelet, meaning that Kohelet's words, which comprises most of the book, is only accepted into the Old Testament canon because of the epilogue's more traditional take on Kohelet. This understanding, it operates under the assumption or understanding that Koheleth's words are in some sense negative, right? While the epilogue is quite positive. So the epilogue functions to show the readers how they ought not to think. Don't follow Koheleth, I think is Tremper Longman's. This is why if you look at his commentary, which is quite a famous commentary, you'll see him discuss Koheleth's theology and the epilogue's theology separately. Longman thinks that the teachings of Koheleth are, quote unquote, unorthodox. And he's also skeptical of the epilogue's affirmation that Koheleth was a hakam, a wisdom teacher. He notes that there are, quote, good sages as well as evil ones, and he references Jonadab and Ahithophel from 2 Samuel. So for him, the theology of the epilogue is normative, and this is written by a wisdom teacher who is an insider of the wisdom tradition. And Koheleth is simply an industrious person who lacks creativity as well as honorifics or terms of respect. Right? This view, again, it assumes that the words of Koheleth are pessimistic, and without the epilogue, Koheleth would really, wouldn't be able to be in the canon. Referring to the words of delight in the epilogue, he writes, if the expression is understood as words that evoked delight, the problem is even more obvious. His words, so Koheleth's words, are troublesome, not pleasant or delightful. In the second place, the frame narrator says that Koheleth sought to write words of truth. Is the frame narrator ready to admit this? I think not. I think this is a misguided way of reading and understanding Ecclesiastes. Like the paper has demonstrated convincingly against Longman that there is indeed a logic of the book. Not only, that logic is found in the work of Koheleth, but it's actually connected to the epilogue. So the epilogue is no longer at odds with the words of Koheleth, but rather a natural conclusion and a recognition of the words of Koheleth as something that is beneficial. There is indeed wisdom, strange as it may be, but nevertheless wisdom to learn and grow from. So even though there may be two voices here, rather than viewing them as being competitive, competing against each other, they are much more in agreement with each other than others assume. I have a couple questions. The first question I think is maybe, comprised of a couple of them again, but here they are. You mentioned in the paper that wisdom's foundation, quote, wisdom's foundation is not creation. It is not observations about the world. The foundation is God's special revelation. That is, the foundation is covenantal. And you also say wisdom presupposes the law. And I agree with this statement. That's where my view would be as well. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this. I can think of a few passages that would support this claim, as you would see in the prologue of Proverbs and the epilogue in Ecclesiastes. So I'm just wondering how you would unpack that. Even though there are, because we see these close observations regarding the created world, these are very similar to what you find in other Egyptian or Mesopotamian wisdom texts. And I think you have the prologue of Proverbs and the epilogue of Ecclesiastes. There's fear of God motifs here and there to tell the readers how not to mistaken this as simply secular wisdom, that there is a foundation here. Wisdom is obtainable within the understanding that we live in God's created world. And so I was wondering if you could speak a few words on that issue, because it is a loaded statement. Just to get our sauce rolling, the question largely has to do with how Ecclesiastes studies has over the years understood the wisdom books vis-a-vis the Old Testament. The wisdom books at one point in the past, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, was regarded as the orphan of the Old Testament, meaning it didn't really look like the Pentateuch or the historical books or the prophetic. It didn't have the prominent themes like covenant and salvation history, God's revelation to the patriarchs, etc. Those that are central to the Old Testament theology, somewhat lacking in the wisdom books. And so the wisdom books, they were characterized as something that they lack. I don't think that's a helpful way to define them. Related to this, how do you understand those statements regarding the natural world that are similar to these ancient Near Eastern wisdom texts within this canon? Because you have these wisdom sayings that are mostly observations of the natural world, and these are quite different from what we see in the Pentateuch or historical books. Second question I have is, you mentioned that those who give central importance to the fear of God motif as being a small minority. Just wondering who they are, and whether you land on the same place as they do, and if and how you differ from them. I think that's an important motif in understanding Ecclesiastes, Proverbs for that matter, and those arguments that find them as somewhat out of place of the movement or the logic of Ecclesiastes, somewhat unconvincing. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that as well. Maybe I'll pause here. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. I'm honored to have Dr. Kim here today as a respondent. And yes, we studied quite closely together in our time. And actually, in many ways, he was like a second supervisor for me in the program when Seitz was away, because he was a little bit further along in the program than me, which means each step of exams or prospectus, or he'd done it just before me, so I could ask him for his advice and how to approach it, both to navigate the exams and to navigate our supervisor. I think I'm supposed to have only 5 minutes to answer these questions, so I have to be a little bit brief. But then we are opening it up to, I think, some larger Q&A, so any particular points that are of an interest, we can spend a little bit more time and focus and cover those. The question of wisdom's foundation is an important one. There was a large trend for quite a while to see wisdom as this alien body or orphan child of the Old Testament that it did not fit, whether because Job and Ecclesiastes represented a wisdom crisis, it was rejecting or departing from the faith, an alternative to Yahwism, or because it just simply had other concerns. It actually belonged more at home in the world of the wisdom of the ancient Near East. It was more universal and less particular with Israel's situation. And there are many who would go that way. But when we look and we read Israel's wisdom, and we read the wisdom books, what we find is not such a universal wisdom, but much more of a particular theology. In all of the hermeneutically significant parts of the books, what we find there is a focus and an emphasis on the fear of the Lord as the beginning of wisdom. The introduction to Proverbs sets this out, and it builds up to the fear of the Lord. And this prologue is supposed to guide the reader as their entry into the whole book. It is the context for understanding all the wisdom that is contained therein. In chapters of Proverbs 1 to 9, which serves as also a little bit of a prologue to the rest of it, it also concludes with this idea of the fear of the Lord, reiterated at these key junctures. The very end of Proverbs, we also find a reference there. The end of Ecclesiastes in this epilogue, the last two verses, fear God and keep his commandments. We see this same idea of this fear the Lord as the foundation of Israel's wisdom. The beginning of wisdom and the end of wisdom as this bracket around this corpus of wisdom material, directing and guiding one's approach to all of this wisdom. Because we said it is contextual. You have to apply it to the right situation, but this is the right foundation and the context. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But what we also don't find in all of these key hermeneutically significant parts, we find a lack of creation material. We don't find, like, because another cohort would see creation as the foundation of wisdom. This wisdom is about observing the world around us, making these observations, go with an open mind, see what you see, discern these orders distilled in creation so that you can live by them. That is this, proposed idea of more international wisdom, and so with maybe Ecclesiastes. But the wisdom tradition isn't so much about this going and observe and see what you can find. It has a much more focus on the received revelation, on receiving the instruction that is passed down to you, not going and making your own. In these hermeneutically significant parts of the books, the prologue and the epilogue, it's about the fear of the Lord, and we see a marked absence of creation. When we say look at the book of Job as well, the introduction emphasizes Job as one who feared God and turned away from evil. It's repeated 3 times in that prologue. It's emphasizing his character as one who fits this wisdom mold. And then when we get like halfway through the book or so, we find this important juncture of this great wisdom poem in chapter 28. Where is wisdom to be found? Is it here? Is it there? People might search for it and dig like they do for buried treasures, but wisdom is not there. Where is wisdom to be found? Then it concludes, fear the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil, that is understanding. So it has this definitive claim that wisdom is not something you go and find in the world. You don't go and find it in creation. It is this found in this covenantal relationship with the Lord and obeying his commandments, turning from evil, submitting to him, fearing the Lord. That is the foundation of all of this wisdom, and that is what everything is built upon. Now, yes, there is room for observations. Go see the ant, observe its ways. There is room for that, but it is all in this context. There is shared wisdom. There is borrowed wisdom. The clearest example that many would point to of Israel borrowing wisdom from the ancient Near East would be Proverbs 22 to 24, the instructions of Amenemo, where the writer of Proverbs would borrow these, and we see similarities in topic, in the themes, in the structure. But when we look at some of the differences, the writer of Proverbs has a key part of the introduction there. It's so that your trust would be in the Lord. It borrows a lot, form, structure, content, but it has a new foundation. It's not just a, uncritical adoption of it. It's an adaptation, borrowing from what's there, but it still has a new foundation that everything comes with the fear of the Lord. And then that whole section concludes with, my son, fear the Lord. And so it has this marked departure. There is a similarity, there is some shared stuff, but there is an unmistakable covenantal foundation where it presupposes this covenantal relationship with the Lord. And only with that does it make sense of still all of the swath of religious material or religious language in the book, because it presupposes the covenant. And this ties into this one of the other questions from Dr. Kim about wisdom's fit with the rest of the canon, because it was often such a strong wedge was driven in between wisdom and the rest of the Old Testament that they would just conclude it doesn't belong. It's an alternative to Israel's faith. It has different concerns, different issues. It more belongs to the rest of the ancient Near East, not Israel's scripture. But when we recognize this proper foundation of the fear of the Lord, we can come back and see, no, it does belong in here, and it actually is quite a complementary witness to the rest that we find in the Old Testament. Much of the Torah's instruction concerns the 2 ways. Particularly if we look at Deuteronomy, there is the 2 ways of the covenant, the way of covenantal obedience and faithfulness, or of disobedience. The way that leads to covenant blessing, or the way that leads to the covenant curses, the way of life and the way of death. There's these 2 ways set before them. And as it moves into the historical books, a lot of it plays out and shows the narrative of times when Israel followed one path and times when Israel followed the other. And it shows the consequences of those choices and actions. While lots of the Torah outlines this in laws and instructions, a lot of the historical books might display it in narratives showing the characters who would follow these and not. And the wisdom material is complementary to this in that it is so concerned with these fundamental two ways, the way of the wise and the way of the fool, used synonymously with the righteous and the wicked. And it's concerned with showing, describing the actions, the motives, the decisions, the attitudes of the people on these two paths. These actions, attitudes, decisions will lead you this way. These ones lead that way. Describe people on the path and describe the ends that they go to. Many laws from the Torah are echoed in Proverbs and in the wisdom literature. Much of the Torah themes are echoed as well. A lot of the religious and cultic language is echoed, but it only really makes sense when you have that as the foundation, you have that as the background. So it is a complementary witness that ties in with all these with the rest of them as they work together. It is not separate, does not have separate concerns, but a complementary witness. I'll probably used up my 5 minutes already. So I think we are opening it to some larger questions that can be not just for me, but also for Dr. Kim as well.
Yeah, well, you can stay up here. You can stay up here. For those online, just drop your questions in the chat, and Jeehoon can read those off. And then people in person as well, just raise your hand, and Ryan will call on you. And yeah, we'll spend some time, and then we'll call it a night. I mean, I have like 1,000 things I want to ask and say, but I'll hold forth. So anyone in person have anything they'd like to ask Ryan?
I have one online already.
Oh, good.
I'll start with that one.
Yeah. So Ryan Sauter is asking Dr. Paul, if in chapter 7, Kohelet acknowledges that wisdom is beyond him, then how would you explain the transition into the concluding imperatives where he is dispensing wisdom? It can at times feel rather abrupt when reading.
Many of Kohelet's changes in his address as he circles from one to the other and makes his revolutions can feel quite abrupt and even repetitive at times. I think the end of chapter 7, where he is confessing his failure and that he could not find wisdom, is particularly connected to his wisdom quest. His address has the effect of an older sage looking back on his life, on his prior efforts and endeavors and failures, and recounting them so that we can learn from them. And so, yes, throughout his quest and those early endeavors, he failed to find this wisdom. But as he learned and as he grew, this aged sage now, in reflection and hindsight, is able to see that he did fail, but is able to, out of that context and out of those experiences, offer wisdom of how to live in this world of Hevel.
The threefold court, how does that tie into your closing where the two echo each other?
What was the first part of that?
The threefold cord.
Oh, the threefold cord?
From chapter 4, yeah.
The cover, or the kind of the span that I did, was a bit high level, just kind of picking an overarching point. Within that address, he goes and he visits many, many different topics, In that section, it seems like a part of a larger section that's talking about the value of people and community. And speaking of that, and he uses a few different numerical proverbs of, not like 2, but 3, increasing, showing the value of there. And he is noting and commending on the value of people and community in that. So I think there's some positive wisdom in there. Positive wisdom is sprinkled throughout the book. At the beginning, he's focused much more on, I did this, I saw this, and I saw this, and I did this, and I concluded this. But then as the book goes on, there's more and more inclusion of instruction here and there as he starts moving through the address. And so there's a lot of pockets of great wisdom throughout, yes.
Question. When you were talking about the more older commentators, more aged ones, when they're looking at judgment, it would seem that they're looking at judgment more as condemnation. But when you look at like the last verse, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil, it seems to be more of a neutral thing. When there's good, judgment, there's reward. Or when there's evil, the judgment is condemnation. But then, yeah, like it's more of an observation than a question, and it's kind of a little bit confusing, like
No, for sure.
how the commentators take that. Because, like, to me, when I read this, it's the parable of the talents. All three were judged, but one was punished, two were rewarded. Like kind of a thing. And now I'm looking at this in context with the entirety, especially with the New Testament over there. But then the commentators are like, as you said, they're trying to push God out over there. It's more of observation than anything else, as you were.
And that's a good observation as well.
Yeah.
I think the bring everything to judgment, whether good or evil, I think also would highlight that God is the one who will decide what is good and what is not. And we may not see that all. Many of it is hidden, but God will bring it all to light. And he is the one who will decide. And he is the one who will judge accordingly. Yeah, good observation.
Follow-up question on that. What is the meaning of mishpat? Because it's not a very judgmental word. It's more of a kind of a justice idea that God will bring things into fairness, perhaps, judgment.
It's fairly wide, and I think a judgment as a punishment can be included in there, but certainly the idea of justice, of a reconciliation, of bringing things to right, can be a part of it as well. The judgment, there's a number of parts throughout the book that he talks about judgment, and in every one of those, there is mention and discussion of moral conduct, of right and wrong before God, of the sinner or the righteous. And so there is a judgment that will put an end to the evil that Kohelet sees. He says he sees that, judgment is not executed, swiftly, and so people will do evil 100 times and will keep doing evil. So he sees the existence and the continuation of evil as something that God will bring judgment on, that God will put an end to. I think there is certainly a punishment aspect to it, but I think it would include a larger component of setting things right to the way they are, even if Kohelet does not see it, because there are times that I don't see it, but he keeps circling back to this hope and belief that, but I know that it will be, and that God will. Yeah, a fuller sense of this judgment of not only a punishment, but setting things right as a justice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
When he speaks in the imperative singular, who is he speaking to?
We only really find his addressee at the beginning of the closing sections, the beginning of this final section, 11:7 to 12:7, where he says, "My son." The common wisdom trope of maybe a father speaking to a son, or as a young man, as the ideal wisdom student. So that's where we may find the singular in that sense. But I think, there's still the impression that it would be to all readers and all hearers as well. We see, the common thing also in Proverbs, a father is teaching a son. And it's common wisdom language. The epilogue in Ecclesiastes has the same thing. But right when he gets to the end of just before his final imperatives there, fear God and keep his commands, we see a reference to my son there. Although I think Kohelet said, "Oh, young man," but it's that the same idea of this prototypical young man wisdom student, representative of all who would hear his wisdom.
Related to the recipient question, Gabriel online is asking, do you ascribe to the belief that Solomon is the author? So I think the question dives into the authorship question of Ecclesiastes, and maybe you have a few words on that.
The authorship question is quite large. The Solomon connection is also a quite large issue as well. That has had a lot of stuff written on over the time. Traditionally, Solomon was seen as the author. Solomon was seen as Kohelet. Most scholarship has left that behind quite some time ago. Most would see the book written as maybe the 3rd century BC. Some would posit it maybe a little earlier in the Persian context, 4th, maybe 5th, but most would go around more a Hellenistic 3rd century BC, so long after Solomon, based on language, form of words. They would put it as a fairly late book. The question of who actually wrote it, I think, is a little bit more of a mystery. But the question of Solomonic connection, as is this Solomon, or how is that supposed to be read? For the other wisdom books or other books that we find, like Proverbs, we find it pretty clear. Like the words of Solomon, we find this explicit connection at the beginning. But when we come to this book, we find the words of Kohelet. We find allusions in his quest and these descriptions that certainly are evocative of Solomon's activities, but we do not see as explicit of a reference. And that has caused a lot of curiosity, such that it would seem that the author is going out of his way to intentionally avoid saying Solomon. I mean, the practice of just, kind of naming somebody would be almost more of a given, and it almost would be expected, but it kind of seems to be intentionally not doing that. Many would see Kohelet as a persona created by, more common now these days, some would see Kohelet as a persona created by the narrator. That maybe the narrator is the one who is saying these things, introducing it, but then uses Kohelet as this character to walk through and present all these things. And sure, there can be echoes of Solomon and his activities, but it's just using that to show, as an example of excessive wealth, of excessive indulgence, of one who had it all, experienced it all, tried it all, could do anything, as a good example. So they would see Solomonic connections there and allusions, but not as necessarily Solomon himself, that not being the point. And excuse me, the progression that we see in the end of Ecclesiastes with this fear God and keep his commandments as the heart of wisdom, that doesn't really line up with the rest of the Old Testament canonicals picture of the end of Solomon's life and his turning away. So it doesn't quite concord that way either.
Yeah, to me, it seems more like David, because he started up good. He did some stupid stuff. He learned from it, and he talks about it a lot in the Psalms. But then, he ends good, and because I walked into this thing thinking that it was Solomon, but as you were going through it, I was like, that does not sound, as you said, it doesn't sound like how he ended. And then I'm like, that sounds more like David, who lived a full life, was wise, but did some really dumb stuff, but ended out really well, kind of a thing. Because when it comes to chapter 12 was 11, no, 9 to 10, it's like it sounds as though that's how David ended, really well, and was well respected and taught that. Do you think it might have been David too? I just never thought about it till now.
There would be, he would fit the mold of maybe one who had started out well, but turned away and maybe ended good, or there's some ebbs and flows in there, and that could be that could overlap. We'd still have the problem of the text seeming to be a fairly late text, well after David's time, based on the language and the borrowing of words from the other languages. So that would be certainly a difficulty. And we still have the difficulty of why does it try so hard to go out of its way to not mention David then? If, half the Psalms are Psalms of David, whether David wrote them or not. And, and wisdom has much more connection to Solomon than to David. It would still have some difficult connections to build a solid case that it was David.
Yeah.
Sorry, before we get to your question, I'll maybe add to that a little bit. It's an interesting question because there's a book written by Jeannie Barber. I forgot what.
Story of Israel.
Yeah, Story of Israel. That's right. And so she argues that Kohelet is the pastiche of all the failed kings of Israel. So you see allusions not only to Solomon, to David, but all the other kings you might see there that, in a sense, try to live a certain way, but ultimately fails, right? And so, I mean, it's an interesting comment that you kind of see David in kind of the portrayal of Kohelet. Yeah. Sorry, you had that.
Are Kohelet's statements about Hevel, are they normative in nature? Or is he simply pointing out the way it is?
Part of that might depend on what you understand Hevel to even mean. In some sense, it could be if he's making a statement that, this is fleeting, like life is fleeting, I would say those pretty normative statements. But I think he is saying, at least for his experiences and his efforts and endeavors, they are, but his experiences might not be the same experiences of others. So he might see and experience justice, or like experience injustice, where justice is not delivered and the righteous are suffering while the wicked are prospering. That might not be somebody else's experience. It is a common reality that we can find again and again and again in the world, but individual experiences will be a little bit different. Part of what he does describe as Hevel is some of his enjoyment and his pursuit of those good things, which he does describe as Hevel, but then later he also does commend the enjoyment of things. So part of it could also come to not just the object in and of itself, but how one pursues it, or one's understanding or acceptance of it. Like enjoyment is good, but it is to be qualified, not excessive. Kohelet condemns indulgence that is excessive, that is inappropriate, that is untimely. So not at the feast at the right times, etc. And so, feasting is good, enjoyment is good, but it can also be done in a way that is not. So I think there's a little bit of nuance there.
This fits in the question that I had around this distinction that was drawn between creation and covenant and, general versus special revelation, whatever categories you want to use there. And this desire that where we stand to have the relationship between those things like transparent, or to be able to discern this sort of like normative law or way within life and say, I've got it now. And Kohelet won't let you do that because covenant and God's self-revelation comes to us primarily through covenant, but that's always within the theater of creation. And so don't separate them because you can't. And it's actually dangerous to do so because your head's up in the clouds and you're not looking at your surroundings, or you're so locked in on your surroundings that you're not focused on God, right? And even the figure of Kohelet himself, it's like we desire to have this one unified person that's always speaking with clarity. And that's not an honest account of the person, right? And so this is why we were talking before, like, it's just not Greek, it's not Platonic at all. It's just, it's Hebraic. The wisdom, the revelation of God comes to us always within the theater of creation, but don't forget the covenant as you're in the stuff. And sometimes, this is right, but sometimes it's not. And wisdom is knowing which one is which and remembering your creator wherever you happen to be. So it's like getting into the details, but then zooming out and that sort of thing. But that confounds us because we want something that's transparent and repeatable and, 3 things that fit into a sermon and such. But yeah, I was quite honest, surprised to hear both of you talk about, this general special, creation and covenant, but I'm like, he's looking at ants and that's reminding him of his creator. So what do you do with that? What do you do with what I'm laying out here? Like, how would you, like, we want to separate and make something normative, but the way of wisdom is so much more plodding along, like on the ground, attentive, but not so sensory you're forgetting your creator.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. The discussions of that I was aiming at was more at what is the foundation or the source behind all the wisdom.
yes,
That it
yes,
is
the
not
backdrop.
really
Yeah.
just, go make your own observations and you decide your own thing.
Yeah.
Or no, but like behind the wisdom, there actually is this covenantal relationship with God, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So within that foundation, that's what's at the bottom. Now, yes, the theme of creation is prominent in there, and there is these experiences. So much of the wisdom is about navigating everyday life. Like the Torah has a lot of laws, but like, surprise, they don't cover everything. There's a lot of life still out there, and a lot of wisdom will say, hey, all of these situations, these circumstances, these things kind of lead you down this path. These ones kind of go here. It's helping direct you how to live in that right relationship in this real and difficult world before God. And so there is a lot of this real life in there. And Kohelet's admission that we don't have all the answers. We don't know everything. We can't control everything as much as we want to think that we can. I think it was an apt description of one who described, particularly the second half of his book, as a hard-won ignorance. And coming to terms with that and acceptance of that before God.
And maybe add to that a little bit. If you look at the first poem in Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, after he states theme of Hevel, he goes on to this poem, and it describes the created world. There's the sun, there's the wind, and there's the waters. And depending on how you read that, it's a very, the way I would see it, it's very harmonious. There's a created world where the wind may seem like it's very random, but it seems like it has purpose to it. The sun always goes back to its place and all that. What follows that, the observation of creation, is kind of the observation of self, I think. This is where you see him saying, all words are wearisome, something like that, right? And in your English translations, it will say all things, I believe, in most translations, but the var can be translated into words, and I think it matches those human faculties where he says all words are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it, right? The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So a lot of the observations, like you mentioned, is happening within the created world. And there's really struggle to understand what human place is in this world that God seemingly created as harmonious. And that's, I think, the struggle of Kohelet that you see. And so I think maybe chapter 3 or 4, definitely in chapter 7, there's this saying, is something like, what God made crooked, man cannot make straight. Right? And that's that's speaking to this kind of struggle that Kohelet is saying. I think what Dr. Ball is saying here, that it's not just though, well, the heck of it, there is no meaning and I'll just, live the way that I want. No, there's a purpose to it, and inviting the readers who have really gone through struggle. Again, going back to the dating, you have, if it's 2nd BCE to 3rd BCE, you have the history of Israel going through real stuff. There's trauma, right? The whole exile thing is happening. And so people are trying to make sense of what's going on. And then you come to Ecclesiastes, where you have someone who walked that path, has tried to make sense of it. And then who says, I tried it. I enjoyed everything. I also know that it was difficult. But you know what? I think this is what matters. And he kind of comes to that conclusion where you so eloquently argue. Esther, yeah.
Dr. Ball, Dr. Kim, thank you so much. This was super exciting to listen. Forgive me, I will speak not as a theologian or ask not as a theologian, but more just adding a bit of a maybe psychology lenses to this. And I finally, maybe I got it a bit, what Ecclesiastes is all about. Because I think the word and the definitions or the words that you put around it makes a lot of sense to me that, breath, vapor, meaningless, transience, enigmatic, mysterious, fleeting, and then joy. To me, all these things go very well together. This is life. And we do that, and then we realize the meaningless or how fleeting it is, and we freak out. And then we come back in the present moment and we enjoy it the best we can. And then we make more goals and we go on and do some of these things. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that that works. When I get lost, where I get lost a little bit is when it talks about fear. To me, it feels like that's when the author is kind of scared to just let it be the way it is. And it needs some structure to it, some kind of a, I need something to ground myself in. And in my world, the word fear and the word wisdom, they don't work together. So that's where I get just a little bit lost. Accepting influence, understanding that what God wants for us is better for us, and seeking that intentionally. But fear, it's more coercive, and I don't know exactly what the definition of wisdom is, because I think it comes to that. What is a crisis of a wisdom crisis? What is a crisis of wisdom? And maybe, yeah, how do you view wisdom, and what is a crisis of wisdom?
Thank you for those great questions. The fear certainly can have this idea of terror or fright, but in Israel's tradition, particularly within the covenant, it has this reverential aspect of fear of the Lord is a recognition of the Lord in his place and his sovereignty over everything and humanity's place before him. And so there could be a comfort and a security there, but also a reverence of him, submitting to him, and submitting to his revealed word, which would encompass aspect of covenantal obedience and following him. So it'd be a recognizing his authority as God and his control, are submitting to him and willingness to follow him. So it's tied, there's a lot tied with Israel's covenant, and fearing God means following him and keeping his law. And so Israel's wisdom tradition, I believe, would hold to that same kind of a foundation. Yes, there are some who would still argue that, no, it's just right because God is cruel, God is oppressive, and God is guilty, and you should be afraid of him, but you can't get away, so best of luck, your life is meaningless.
On that note,
I think there is a little more. So a reverential respect, recognizing his position, and submission to him.
yeah.
Thank you, Ryan.
Dr. Crick.
Joel, one of our faculty heading online has a question about eschatology. Joel, you'll have to ask it next time in your office because I think we're running out of time. So, sorry, Joel. That is a really wonderful question, though, and a place to end. And it just so happened that I was talking about nihilism with undergraduates today. We're doing a worldview course, and we were talking about Ecclesiastes, and I was showing them clips from Seinfeld. That captures nihilism very well. But there's a scene where Kramer is asking George Costanza, "Do you yearn for anything?" And George says, "No, I just have cravings." So there's kind of the comedy of it, of the sort of meaninglessness, but there's also the horror of it and the fear. And Kramer pushes, George towards the fear side of things. But one of the things I think about is like thinking about wisdom as rightly ordered fear. What do we fear most, right? And if it's the beginning, what's the end? Well, John's gospel says perfect love casts out fear. So if the beginning of wisdom is fear of God, and all the other fears fall into place under that, then what does that lead to? A loving God who reaches out in the midst of meaninglessness. And man, we need that for today. That's a word of hope in a world of a lot of people who are in despair. And so for me, that we can get together and talk about these things and grow together is such a joy. So thank you for coming and your comments and your engagements. And thank you to our presenters. So awesome. If you're not on the lifelong learning newsletter, get on there because we're always doing stuff. That's the best way to find out. And also, I'll email you a feedback form. We want to hear what your experience was, because actually, we get funding to do this, and as a part of that, we have to provide reports on how things go. So your feedback really matters. Actually, it really does. So please.
And also your word of mouth to everybody else. I mean,
as well.
As you can see, the quality of the presentation this evening is way up there. And so we want to promote the symposiums as much as possible. Please let other people know what a great thing we're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.